On August 26th, in the year 1980, a metal box was quietly delivered to Harvey's Wagon Wheel Casino in State Line, Nevada, with approximately 1 ton of dynamite inside. Once discovered, the FBI entered the building to try and deactivate the bomb, which was later identified as one of the most complex improvised explosive devices they had ever encountered. A note was left demanding $3 million in cash in return for directions on how to get the bomb out of the casino safely. Unfortunately, it ended up going off, causing a cataclysmic 5-story hole in the resort and causing millions of dollars in damage to the property. After a tenuous manhunt for the perpetrator, it was later revealed that the orchestrator and creator of the complex IED was a Hungarian immigrant named John Burgess Sr., who had many connections to the casino as a regular at the establishment. John Burgess Sr. was placed at a bail of $2 million and was later found guilty of stealing the dynamite, manufacturing the bomb, and setting it off, causing the property damage to Harvey's casino, and was subsequently sentenced to life in prison with no opportunity for parole. There were many notable highlights from this case in both the execution of the sentencing and the handling by law enforcement. We firmly believe that the sentencing of the case against Burgess Sr. was right and just, with some slight flaws to the execution of the courtroom. However, overall, he deservedly received a guilty sentence for his crimes.
Now that you've been given some background on the case, we're going to dive into the law enforcement side of what took place on the day of the Harvey Casino bombing. So to begin, the FBI had immediate authority over the case because of the Nevada-California state line. That interstate commerce is what landed the jurisdiction. Special Agent Bill Jonke out of Carson City was immediately dispatched to take over the case. Local agencies were there, but they were just there for backup and, going for along for the ride. And we'll see in a second, that backup was really needed. There were two big decisions. First, the ransom delivery. The FBI got Harvey Gross, the owner of the casino, to set up a fake payoff to stall the bomber and buy some time. Sounds good, right? But Burgess, the bomber, gave vague directions, probably on purpose. The drop went to the wrong spot. And just like that, any chance of negotiating was dead. Now, it's all in the bomb squad. Which leads to the second decision. And this is the big one. Bomb techs, Army OD, the Nuclear Emergency Search Team, all rotating in and out for hours upon hours, taking x-rays and photographs. They settle on one decision. Use the C4 to cut the control wiring. They tell the boss, the owner, Harvey Gross, it'll probably fail. He says, go ahead and try it. And it absolutely failed, just like they said it would. The bomb went off, took out most of the hotel. The bomb, luckily for everyone, the hotel was evacuated. But now, the only evidence they have is whatever's left in the rubble. About a year later, the FBI tracks a van to Burgess' son in Fresno. He lies to the grand jury, gets arrested, and the agents basically say, tell us everything you know, or go to federal prison. He folds, obviously, and gives up absolutely everything about the case. Technically illegal, but how much can you trust somebody's testimony if you basically blackmailed them into doing it? Now, we're going to tie this back to Pecker's crime control model. Every decision here was made of the FBI agents and the officers on the case, their own discretion. It works until it doesn't, right? The biggest takeaway, I would say, is that they used the replica bomb. They made a replica of the bomb for FBI training. Because at some point, you have to turn what you learned into something the next guy can actually use.
All right. So prosecutors are one of the most common and powerful faces that you normally see in a courtroom. Whereas defense attorneys, public or private, represent their client, who is the defendant of a criminal trial. Prosecutors represent the United States government and whoever may be the victim of the defendant's accused actions, such as an entire community. In America, all who have been All who have a criminal case lobbied against them are considered innocent until proven guilty. Consequently, the burden of proof, or the need to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, falls entirely on the prosecutor. With this case in particular, the major goal of the prosecution was to charge Burgess Sr. and his accomplices. In order to accomplish this, the prosecution relied heavily on physical evidence, both of the bomb itself and the extortion letter for the pilot, as well as the testimony from both of Burgess's sons, as well as his associate Terry Hall. The first major discretionary decision made by the prosecution during the trial dealt with the testimony of Burgess Sr.'s two sons. During the trial, it was imperative for the prosecution to have damning evidence in order to best sway the jury to get a guilty verdict. The sons both had a great deal of information on the conspiracy and further bombing, as they were directly included in the delivery of the bomb to the resort and hotel. In one of the most significant decisions of the trial, the prosecution decided to not pursue the full criminal charges and penalties against the two sons, only in the event that they provided testimony against their father. As a result of their cooperation, the two sons received suspended sentences for their contribution to the prosecution of their father. This decision exercised great levels of discretion from the prosecution, as they could have thrown the proverbial book at the sons and charged everyone in the case with the absolute maximum. Additionally, cooperation agreements such as this one not only inherently discretionary, however, they are also commonly seen in criminal cases as a type of plea bargain. In situations such as this one, prosecutors must weigh the values of both the seriousness of the offense and the potential value of cooperation. Lastly, the prosecution's leniency is not something that's required by law, but it was more of like a strategic play to further strengthen the case against Burgess Sr. Another major discretionary decision made by the prosecution was the individual charges brought up against the two who had the most to do with the bomb. That was Burgess Sr. and Terry Hall, his associate. The main charges include conspiracy, interstate travel, and aid of racketeering, attempting to interfere with commerce by threats of violence, and finally, transportation of explosives in interstate commerce. While it may seem like the two men received the absolute maximum, it's actually a perfect example of a discretionary decision made by the prosecution. Like previously mentioned, the role of a prosecutor is to both represent the United States government as well as decide which charges are to be lobbied against the defendants. In this case, the prosecution had a number of different avenues they could have took in charging the men, such as extortion, terroristic threatening, hundreds of counts of attempted murder due to the potential lethality and payload of the bomb. However, they chose to not pursue extreme charges and instead stuck with the previously mentioned charges that would maximize the likelihood of conviction based on the evidence they had available. This is another great example of discretionary decisions where prosecutors only chose to lobby the charges they felt would have the greatest likelihood of sticking. And as for the ethical tensions, the most ethically gray portion of the entire case against Burgess Sr. deals with the previous decision we talked about regarding his sons. In exchange for their cooperation and providing testimony against their father, they were both awarded significantly lighter sentences compared to if they just pled guilty. While plea deals and bargains are one of the most common reasons criminal proceedings almost never go to trial, it raises an important question, that being, when does incentivization cross the line into coercion? The deal that the prosecution made is ethically concerning due to the fact that it immediately creates a power imbalance. Basically, Burgess' sons were two young men at the time. They were reasonably frightened by facing severe federal charges, and the immense leverage that the prosecution held over the two could have resulted in a compromised testimony due to pure incentivization.
Or my name is Matthew Obiala, and I am the defense attorney in the United States of America versus John Waldo Berg Sr., 1984. Berg Sr. is being charged with unlawful possession and transportation of explosives, use of explosives to commit a crime, making a bomb threat, and extortion. In my analysis, I will explain some of the complications within Berg Sr.'s case, including some discretionary decisions and ethical dilemmas within the trial. Regarding the discretionary decisions of John Berg Sr. pleading not guilty to all of his charges, which was an odd choice at the time. When Berg Sr. pled not guilty, all of his collaborators had also been arrested for corroborating the bombing with him, but they had either quickly accepted plea deals or pleaded guilty to their crimes in hopes of being spared during sentencing. This was also an unexpected decision because there was an overwhelming amount of evidence gathered against him and lots of clear motivation to commit the crime. If John Berg Sr. had pleaded guilty, he likely would have not spent life in prison and could have had a lighter sentence for his crimes. The defense counsel has also failed to subpoena witnesses to speak on Berg Sr.'s behalf because the prosecution has taken most of the witnesses offering plea deals to them, making it hard to gather accurate testimonies. If witnesses and his two sons were able to speak for John Berg Sr., then I believe he would have gotten a lighter sentence as well, because they could have highlighted the mitigating circumstances of his life and why he may have felt compelled to commit his crime. There were also plenty of ethical tensions in this case, and now, considering the mitigating circumstances of Berg Sr.'s life, we can understand part of why he committed the crime and why the prosecution and court should have considered his perspectives and life experiences before sentencing. Berg Sr. had an extremely traumatic and hard life, which inevitably led to his downfall with the Harvey Casino bombing. Born and raised in Hungary, Berg Sr. fought in World War II battles and was then taken as a prisoner of war by Soviet forces. He was forced to work as a Russian translator and do other labors as well, while in prisoner of war camps. When he moved to America with his wife, he opened multiple businesses and multiple restaurants and progressed his lifestyle with fathering two sons as well. But he struggled with alcoholism, largely attributed to his traumatic experiences in World War II. He struggled with alcoholism, and then became aggressive at home until his wife got a divorce from him, leaving him alone with few connection to his sons and his businesses. However, soon after the divorce, Elizabeth, Berg Sr.'s ex-wife, committed suicide, deeply saddening the boys and ruining their family dynamic. In turn, he then turned to gambling, where he'd spend most of his weekends in Stateline, Nevada at various casinos, wasting his money away until he eventually went bankrupt and lost all of his businesses. This is when he came up with the idea to create the bomb and attempt to extort Harvey's Wagon Wheel Casino for around $3 million to get his life back together. Overall, while his actions are still inexcusable, his life experiences are a main cause of why he turned out the way he did, and the system should recognize his misfortunes during the sentencing. And lastly, the quality of counsel. Berg Sr. claimed that since he could not afford a lawyer, he was appointed an unfair lawyer who was unable to subpoena witnesses and did a poor job of representing him because he couldn't afford one, and it was the state that appointed one to him. So he believed that his Sixth Amendment right was violated and that he did not get access to a fair trial as well.
Hey, my name is Camden Carney, and today I'm going to talk about John Burgess and what his time in prison looked like from a correctional officer's point of view. I think this case really stands out because of how serious and planned out his crime was, which also made him a high-risk inmate. After Burgess was convicted for the Harvey's Casino bombing, he was sent to prison where correctional officers became responsible for supervising him every day. I think with someone like Burgess, officers had to treat his situation differently than a normal inmate. His crime involved a large explosive and a detailed plan, so I feel like officers had to be more alert when dealing with him. One thing that stands out to me is how officers had to constantly watch his behavior. Even though he was older, I don't think that made him less of a concern. Officers likely paid attention to how he acted, who he talked to, or whether he followed rules. I think they had to make sure he wasn't causing problems with other inmates in a negative way. Another example is where he was housed. I imagine Burgess was placed in a more controlled or secure area because of the seriousness of his crime. Officers had to decide how much supervision he needed and whether he should be separated from other inmates. I think those decisions were really important because they could affect the safety of the whole facility. I also think officers had to be careful with how they treated him. Even though his crime was extreme, I still think they still had to follow rules and treat him fairly. They can't punish him for based on what he did in the past. I feel like that would be difficult, but it's an important part of the job to stay professional. As time went on, Burgess became a long-term inmate. He spent over 16 years in prison, which means the officer had to manage him for a long period of time. Or many officers, not just one. I think that changes things because it's not just about short-term control. It's about keeping things stable over years. Officers had to make sure he stayed in line with prison routines and didn't create ongoing issues. In the end, Burgess died in prison in 1996 at the age of 74 from liver cancer. To me, this shows that he spent the rest of his life under the supervision of officers. They were responsible for the time that he entered from the time that he entered the prison to the time that he died. Overall, I think Burgess's case shows how challenging it can be to manage a high-risk inmate or even many at a time. Correctional officers had to stay alert, make careful decisions, and treat him fairly the entire time. Focusing on Burgess himself really shows how much responsibility the officers have when dealing with someone who committed such a serious crime.
So, for our final analysis of the John Berg Sr. case, we notice a lot of the interdependence between the systems, the judicial system, specifically how the interaction between the police and the prosecution led into the case a lot. The arrests of multiple people beyond just John led to there being a lot more testimonies against John, getting his relatives to turn against him, getting girlfriends to turn against him and testify and discover that those people were also involved in the original police investigation led to his prosecution later in the case. Another thing was he was sentenced to life in prison and he died of cancer in prison. And it's a bit of a concern because while his crime was horrible, it was really only a property crime, and he didn't seem to have the intentions to kill people. That's why he left the note, and that's why people evacuated the buildings. It was purely just to get money because he was in such a detrimental state of his life. But he was sentenced to life in prison, and back then in the 80s, maybe there was a chance that they didn't give him enough medical attention because they knew he was going to be in there for the rest of his life. And so he might not have gotten the quality of treatment that he deserved from the correctional officers and from the prison that he was sent to. And his sentence seemed very incapacitation based. A lot of what we talked about in class this semester was retribution, rehabilitation, deterrence, and it kind of just felt like in this case that the sentence was just to move this alcoholic, gambling man off the streets while there's clearly underlying issues in his life that we discussed in the mitigating circumstances, that could have offered maybe better retribution or rehabilitation. Because, like I said, he didn't kill anybody. Nobody was hurt in the process of his crime. It just caused a lot of property damage. And I think, considering the mitigating circumstances as well, he deserved a rehabilitation for his issues that led and caused him to commit these crimes. So overall, we thought that this case was very interesting. It was a very different one than what we were expecting. But John Berg Sr. could have been, his sentencing could have been very different. And the defense did not serve as it was intended to, leading to his inevitable sentencing of life in prison.